dawn of April 6, 1862, broke not with the clap of thunder, but with a profound and deceptive peace over the rolling hills and tangled ravines of southwestern Tennessee. This was a raw, nascent landscape, where small farms carved from the wilderness stood as isolated testament to pioneer grit, their fields of winter wheat and corn stubble punctuated by dense thickets of underbrush and forests of oak, hickory, and pine, so thick they were known as the jungle. A soft, misty light filtered through the budding leaves, painting the clearings around a humble, rough-hewn log church named Shiloh Meeting House in a gentle golden hue. The air, thick with the primordial scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, pine sap, and the sweet fragrance of blooming dogwood and wild azaleas, carried the distant, cheerful calls of waking cardinals and wood thrushes, and the lazy crackle of smouldering campfires from 1,000 company streets. This bucolic scene was Pittsburgh Landing, a nondescript, muddy bluff on the winding, rain-swollen Tennessee River, now host to the sprawling, disorganized encampment of the 40,000-strong Union Army of the Tennessee, under the command of Major General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant himself was absent that fateful Saturday, his headquarters established 9 miles downriver at Savannah, his personal attention divided by administrative duties and a painful, swollen ankle from a recent fall from his horse. These men in blue, volunteers and raw recruits from Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa were still green. Their enthusiasm and confidence forged more in the easy, almost bloodless victories at Forts Henry and Donelson than in the terrifying, chaotic crucible of open combat. They drilled with a lack of urgency. They wrote long, boastful letters home, filled with talk of quick victory and a soon return. They grumbled about the hardtack and salt pork rations, and they waited with a naive complacency, utterly convinced the Confederate forces under the combined command of Generals Albert Sidney Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard were demoralized and cowering in their fortified bastion at Corinth, Mississippi, 20 miles to the south. They were an armed camp, not a battle line. Their rifles were neatly stacked in pyramids. Their artillery horses were unhitched and grazing, their minds on anything but the fight to come. The profound silence of that April morning was a grand and tragic illusion, a pastoral veil over the mouth of hell. What they could not see, what their inexperienced and lax picket lines failed to discern in the shadowy, tangled undergrowth to the south, was the slow, deliberate, and massive advance of the 44,000-man Confederate Army of Mississippi, a vast grey and butternut serpent uncoiling itself from the woods, its line of battle stretching for over 3 miles, its steel fangs bared for a desperate killing strike aimed at the very heart of Grant's dispersed corps. Through a combination of forced marches, sheer luck, and Union overconfidence, they had achieved what military theorists dream of: near-perfect tactical surprise. The sleeping, unsuspecting Union camps were about to become the anvil upon which the fledgling Confederacy hoped to shatter Grant's rising reputation, reclaim the strategically vital Western theater, and prove to a watching world that their new nation was born not merely to protest, but to endure and prevail on the field of honor. General Albert Sidney Johnston, a tall, imposing, and dignified Texan upon whom the Confederacy had pinned its highest hopes and who was considered by President Jefferson Davis to be the finest soldier on the entire continent, had personally orchestrated this audacious, all-or-nothing gamble. Stung by the losses of Forts Henry and Donelson and the subsequent Confederate retreat from Kentucky and much of Tennessee, Johnston knew that a defensive war in the vast Western theater was a slow death sentence. His plan, conceived in the stifling confines of his Corinth headquarters, was a masterpiece of Napoleonic audacity, a massive, concentrated assault designed to crush the enemy in his camps before he could fully consolidate his forces. The strategy was to roll up the exposed Union left flank like a rug, drive the entire panicked army north and east, away from the expected reinforcements of General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio, which was slowly marching from Nashville, and crush it against the rain-swollen, unforgiving banks of the Tennessee River, a natural barrier that would become a watery grave. His weapon was a motivated, patriotic, but also largely inexperienced and poorly equipped army, a citizen force of farmers, clerks, and lawyers who would soon unleash the terrifying, ululating cry that would become known as the rebel yell, a sound meant to instill fear and demonstrate unbridled ferocity. The tactical doctrine drilled into his corps commanders, Hardee, Bragg, Polk, and Breckinridge, was the relentless frontal assault, reliant on sheer elan, cold steel, and the concentrated firepower of brigades and regiments moving in concert, a tactic that prized momentum and shock above all else. The primary instrument of the common soldier, both Union and Confederate, was the 577 caliber Enfield or 58 caliber Springfield rifle musket, a weapon whose revolutionary conical Minié ball projectile and spiraled, rifled barrel granted it a lethal effective range of 500 yards, a staggering distance that rendered the battlefields of this war fundamentally different and far more deadly than anything seen in the European wars of the previous century. The officers, many of them West Point classmates who had studied the same Germanian texts on Napoleonic warfare, still thought and commanded in terms of smoothbore muskets with a 100-yard range and decisive, morale-shattering bayonet charges. The technology of killing had made a quantum leap forward, but the tactical doctrines of the officer corps had not yet caught up, creating a brutal disconnect where 19th century tactics met 19th century technology. This fatal miscalculation, this lag between the reality of the weapon and the theory of its use, would write the day's first and bloodiest lesson in the churned bloody mud of the Shiloh Plateau. The first contact was not a coordinated volley from a formed battle line, but a scattered, distant, almost hesitant popping, like a string of firecrackers set off in the deep woods before a holiday celebration, as a Union reconnaissance patrol from the 25th Missouri, under the command of the vigilant Colonel Everett Peabody, collided with the advancing Confederate skirmishers from General Hardee's corps in the grey, pre-dawn gloom near Fraley Field. It was a sound initially dismissed by complacent Union brigade commanders like General Appler as nothing more than aggressive picket firing or a minor cavalry skirmish, but Peabody, a man possessed of a veteran's intuition and a profound sense of foreboding, knew better. He had deliberately disobeyed the direct orders of his superior to send a strong force forward to probe the woods. And in doing so, this unsung hero bought Grant's stunned army perhaps 30 precious, irreplaceable minutes of warning, a delay paid for with his own life as he would fall later that morning. Then, as the sun finally burned through the mist and cast long, dramatic shadows across the landscape, the green-grey tide burst its final dam. The Confederate battle lines emerged from the tree line, not as a rabble, but in perfect, terrifying order, a long, sweeping wave of grey and butternut wool, crashing with irresistible force upon the utterly unsuspecting breakfast-time camps of Sherman's and Prentice's divisions. The pastoral calm of moments before evaporated in an instant, replaced by a storm of man-made hell. The air, once filled with the serene symphony of birdsong, was now ripped apart by the sharp, wicked shriek of Minié balls, the deafening roar of cannon-firing canister and shell, and the primordial, unnerving scream of the rebel yell that seemed to come from 10,000 throats at once. Men in blue, barely awake, stumbled half-dressed from their Sibley tents and crude log huts, fumbling for their stacked rifles, pulling on boots over bare feet, trying to button their jackets, only to be scythed down where they stood, their blood instantly staining the pages of half-written letters home and mingling with the overturned coffee boiling over campfires. It was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a slaughter, a chaotic, nightmarish melee. The Union front line crumbled with stunning speed. Regiments like the 53rd Ohio disintegrating into a panicked, leaderless mob, throwing down their weapons and fleeing blindly toward the perceived safety of the river and the landing. Their unit cohesion and raw courage stripped away in the first violent, shocking minutes of the assault. The Confederates, sensing a total war-ending victory was within their grasp, poured exultantly into the captured camps, and in a fatal, nearly universal lapse of discipline born of hunger and opportunity, thousands of weary, ill-supplied soldiers broke ranks to plunder the abandoned Union supplies, steaming hot breakfasts, new boots, fine officers' whiskey, warm blankets, and all the luxuries of a stationary army they had long gone without. That momentary human pause That critical loss of offensive momentum to satisfy basic human hunger and greed would prove to be a hidden cost of incalculable value to the Union cause, a self-inflicted wound on the Confederate offensive that stole the initiative at the very moment it was most needed. What seemed in the first hours like a disorganized general rout began, through the sheer desperate will to survive, to slowly crystallize into isolated, uncoordinated pockets of heroic, doomed resistance. The Union Army, in its very disintegration, was learning to fight in the cauldron of its own near destruction, its soldiers and junior officers discovering a tenacity they did not know they possessed. At a dense, sunken wagon track in the center of the collapsing Union line, a defensive position formed almost by accident, a topographic quirk that would become legendary. Brigadier General Benjamin Prentiss, a stern and determined man whose division was being systematically shredded, with the remnants of his own shattered command and fragments of W.H.L. Wallace's division, recognized this eroded road as a natural trench, a ready-made fortress wall. This was the Hornet's Nest. For 7 critical, blood-soaked hours, from mid-morning until late afternoon, Prentiss's beleaguered force, which would swell and dwindle as broken units from the flanks fell back on his position but never break, held back the concerted, repeated assaults of over 10,000 Confederates. The name was earned honestly and would be remembered forever. The air was so thick with whizzing, cracking, and slapping lead that soldiers on both sides said it sounded like a massive hornet's nest being struck repeatedly with a stick, a constant, unnerving din that presaged a painful death. The Confederates, believing this stubborn strongpoint to be the final key knot of resistance holding their grand victory at bay, threw division after division at the position in a series of piecemeal, uncoordinated attacks. General Bragg, stubborn and inflexible, ordered assault after frontal assault, refusing to bypass the position. His brigades advanced in textbook linear formations, banners flying, and were mowed down in textbook killing zones by concentrated volleys of musketry and blasts of double-shotted canister from Captain Andrew Hickenlooper's battery and other Union artillery pieces. The sunken road became a bloody lane, a topographic scar choked with the dead and dying in grey and butternut, a grim testament to the futility of brute force against a determined defence in a prepared, natural defensive terrain. It was here that the Confederate offensive lost its cohesion and its vital momentum, its timetable shattered, its energy bleeding away into the stubborn, blood-soaked soil of this one, insignificant-looking field. And it was here, in the heat and smoke and desperate struggle for the Hornet's Nest, in a small blossoming peach orchard to the west of the sunken road, that the Confederacy suffered its most catastrophic, non-material loss, a blow from which its war effort in the West would never fully recover. General Albert Sidney Johnston, the commanding presence, the man whose very name was a rallying cry for his army and for the entire Confederacy, had ridden forward to the very front lines to personally rally a brigade of Tennessee troops who were wavering under heavy fire and lying down to avoid the storm of lead. It was a gesture of immense, almost antique, personal courage, the act of a general who led from the front. In the chaos of the close-range fighting, a single Minié ball struck him behind the right knee, severing his popliteal artery. Unnoticed in the heat of the fight, and having earlier, in a chivalrous gesture, sent his personal physician away to attend to a group of wounded Union soldiers, Johnston slowly bled to death into his cavalry boot. He slumped in his saddle, his pallor worsening, and by the time his concerned staff, including Tennessee Governor Isham Harris, realized the gravity of the situation and got him off his horse, it was too late. A tourniquet was applied with a handkerchief, but the lifeblood of the Confederacy's most celebrated general in the West had already drained away. The brain and nerve center of the Confederate Army was gone, the command structure irrevocably fractured. Command devolved to General P.G.T., Beauregard in the rear, a capable and flamboyant officer, but one who was not Johnston. He lacked the overarching strategic vision, the personal magnetism, and the universal respect of the Army's corps commanders to effectively control the sprawling, chaotic, and increasingly disorganized fight. The flow of Confederate attacks became even more disjointed and uncoordinated, with corps commanders acting on their own initiative without a central, guiding hand. The fatal focal point remained the magnet of the hornet's nest, drawing in Southern blood and valor in a series of costly frontal assaults. To finally silence this stubborn stronghold, Beauregard, now in command, did what had previously been unthinkable or logistically impossible. He massed over 62 cannon from various commands, a grand battery under the overall direction of Colonel James Trudeau, along a slight ridge facing the hornet's nest, and, at point-blank range of less than 300 yards, unleashed the full, concentrated, earth-shaking fury of the Confederate artillery arm on the position. It was the largest concentration of artillery yet seen on the American continent. A thunderous, continuous roar that tore the hornet's nest apart, shredding trees, men, and any semblance of order, turning the sunken road into a blasted hellscape. Prentiss, surrounded, his position collapsing, his ammunition nearly exhausted, and with Confederate forces like General Breckinridge's swirling around his flanks, made the grim, pragmatic calculation to surrender himself and nearly 2,200 of his surviving, battered men around 5:30 p.m. It was a tactical victory for the Confederates, the capture of a key position and a large body of prisoners, but a Pyrrhic one of the highest, most devastating order. The 7-hour delay, the magnificent, stubborn sacrifice of Prentiss and his men, had stolen the day. It had brought Grant, who had arrived on the field by mid-morning aboard his steamer, the Tigress, to find his army in near rout, the one thing he so desperately needed: time. As the final shots echoed around the captured position and the long grey shadows of a tumultuous evening began to lengthen across the ghastly field, the Union line had, through sheer force of will and the Herculean efforts of officers like Grant, Sherman, and McClelland, reformed into a new, tighter, and far more formidable semicircular shield protecting the vital Pittsburgh Landing and the final escape routes. It was anchored by a final, steep, and terrifying ridge, later dubbed Grant's Last Line, or the Final Line of Hope, swarming with rallied stragglers, determined survivors, artillery reserves rushed from the landing, and fresh troops from Lew Wallace's wayward division, all bristling with over 50 massed cannon from across the army, their black muzzles trained ominously on the advancing, exhausted Confederates. Adding their deep-throated, unnerving roar to the fray were the guns of the Union timber-clad gunboats, USS Lexington and USS Tyler on the river. Stationed just offshore, their massive, arcing naval shells, 8-inch and 32-pound rounds, began to crash with earth-shattering, random force into the Confederate lines in the gathering dusk, a new and terrifying form of indirect warfare that sowed confusion, terror, and a sense of helplessness among the exhausted, disorganized Southern ranks. The Confederate Army was spent, its command structure fractured by Johnston's death, its grand assault momentum gone, its finest units decimated in the Hornet's Nest assaults, its regiments intermingled and disorganized from a day of hard fighting and advance. Beauregard, receiving reports of the captured Hornet's Nest and the Union's apparent collapse across the field, and unaware of the true strength of Grant's final position, or the imminent arrival of Buell, believed he had won a costly but decisive victory. He called off the final twilight assault against Grant's final line, a decision that remains one of the most debated what-ifs of the entire war. From his headquarters in the captured Shiloh Church, he famously telegraphed Richmond with the triumphant, premature news of a glorious victory, stating the Union Army was beaten and retreating in disorder. But the Union Army was not destroyed. It was bloodied, shocked to its core, humiliated, but it was still a coiled, defiant fist on the riverbank, its back to the water, with nowhere left to run and a grim determination setting in. And as a cold, torrential, pitiless rain began to fall, soaking the ghastly field of 4,000 acres and the nearly 16,000 wounded and dying men from both armies who lay upon it, a new sound, more ominous to the Southern cause than any cannonade, could be heard across the river. The steady, rhythmic, endless tramp of thousands of fresh, disciplined boots on newly laid pontoon bridges and the splash of oars from a flotilla of transports. Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio and the long-lost division of Lew Wallace, which had taken a wrong turn on its march, were finally decisively arriving, transforming a near-catastrophic defeat into the looming promise of a counterattack. The rain fell in relentless, chilling sheets, turning the fields and roads into a soupy, boot-sucking quagmire of mud, blood, and human waste. It soaked the wounded of both armies, who lay scattered and intermingled across the terrible landscape, their agonized, delirious cries for water, for mothers, for wives, for death, mingling with the peals of thunder and the eerie, spectral crackle of lightning that periodically illuminated the macabre scene in stark, horrifying flashes, revealing frozen tableaus of the dead in grotesque poses, the glittering eyes of scavenging animals, and the desperate movements of the few stretcher-bearers and chaplains braving the storm. Men with minor wounds sought refuge in water-filled shell craters under the bloated, stiffening carcasses of dead horses, anywhere to escape the punishing elements and the lingering, sporadic sniper fire that cracked through the darkness. For General Ulysses S. Grant, the night was the supreme test of his command and personal fortitude. Wounded in spirit by the day's disaster and the near destruction of his army, pressured by frightened subordinates like General McCook to withdraw across the river to save what was left, he could have chosen a path of caution and preservation. But Grant, sheltering under a great oak tree, his ankle throbbing, sipping black coffee and endlessly smoking cigars, the glowing ember a tiny beacon in the oppressive gloom, was made of a different, colder metal. He knew something Beauregard, comfortable and victorious in his distant headquarters, did not. While the Confederates had spent their last ounce of offensive force, he was being massively, overwhelmingly reinforced by Buell's fresh legions. The famous quote attributed to him that night, spoken to a worried, rain-soaked General William Tecumseh Sherman, "Tonight, we'll water our horses in the Tennessee River tomorrow," was not a boast or a hopeful prediction. It was a statement of iron resolve, the cold, unshakable, almost mathematical determination that would define his generalship and ultimately win the war. The man who would become unconditional surrender Grant was forged not in the glow of victory, but in the cold, wet, miserable, and seemingly hopeless defeat of that terrible, endless night, his will to fight on becoming the will of his entire army. The green, overconfident, almost naive volunteers of April 5th were gone, replaced by hardened, grim-faced soldiers who had stared into the abyss of total defeat and survived, their innocence stripped away, replaced by a veteran's weary resolve. And now they advanced not as a broken mob, but as part of a massive, relentless, and coordinated counterattack all along the line, reinforced by Buell's fresh, disciplined formations from Kentucky and Tennessee, and the belated but welcome division of Lew Wallace. Grant, his command now unified, and his numbers swelled to over 55,000, seized the initiative with a vengeance, pushing his rejuvenated forces forward against the Confederate lines which had, in the night, crept perilously close to his final stand. The momentum of the battle had irrevocably shifted. The Confederates, who had fought with such ferocity, sacrifice, and hope the day before, were now critically outnumbered, outgunned, physically spent from a day of intense combat and a night of misery, disorganized, and dangerously low on ammunition. They fought a stubborn, desperate, and skillful rearguard action, contesting every yard of the blood-soaked ground they had so recently and dearly won, turning the captured hornet's nest and the bullet-scarred peach orchard into temporary defensive positions. But the spirit of the offensive was gone. The elastic of their grand assault had been stretched to its absolute breaking point on the previous day, and now snapped back with violent, overwhelming force. By mid-afternoon, after hours of hard seesaw fighting across fields now littered with the corpses of the previous day's struggle, Beauregard, recognizing the futility of continuing against the ever-swelling, relentless Union ranks, and receiving grim, cascading reports of mounting casualties and collapsing units, gave the order for a general, disciplined withdrawal. The Confederate army, though beaten, disengaged with considerable skill under immense pressure, leaving the ghastly, rain-soaked field to the Union, and began the grim, heartbreaking, and exhausting march back through the mud to Corinth, their great gamble for salvation having failed utterly. The Union army, itself too battered, too shocked, and too disorganized by its own near-death experience to mount a vigorous, pressing pursuit, let them go, content to hold the field and tend to its countless wounded. The 2-day Battle of Shiloh was over. The casualty figures, when finally tallied weeks later, stunned a nation that had yet to comprehend the brutal industrial scale of the conflict it had unleashed. Approximately 13,000 Union and 10,700 Confederate casualties, 23,546 men killed, wounded, captured, or missing. This was more American casualties than in the Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Mexican-American War combined. The ground at Shiloh was not merely won, it was physically and spiritually saturated, a place where the very soil seemed to weep blood. Shiloh shattered, once and for all, the cherished illusion on both sides of a short, glorious, and relatively bloodless war, decided by a few grand decisive battles fought with antique notions of chivalry. It was a brutal national awakening to the grim reality of total modern war, a struggle that would demand the complete mobilization of a nation's manpower, its industrial might, its economic resources, and its collective will to endure a long, dark harvest of death on a scale hitherto unimagined. Tactically, the Union had held the field against a surprise attack of stunning ferocity. More importantly, strategically, it now held the gateway to the Deep South. The path into northern Mississippi, the vital railroad junction at Corinth, and ultimately the great spinal artery of the Mississippi River itself, were now open and vulnerable to the relentless Union advance. The Confederacy, having failed in its supreme effort to destroy Grant's army, lost its best and last chance to regain the strategic initiative in the Western theater. From Shiloh onward, the Confederacy in the West would be almost permanently on the strategic defensive, reacting to Union moves. The death of Albert Sidney Johnston was a loss of leadership and prestige, from which the Confederate command structure in the West would never fully recover, leading to a troubled succession of less capable and often squabbling commanders like Beauregard and Bragg. And in Ulysses S. Grant, the North found its first general with the grim, unshakable, and unsentimental determination to see the war through to its bloody conclusion, no matter the cost, understanding that the arithmetic of attrition now favored the North. President Abraham Lincoln, when pressured by frightened politicians and a horrified public to remove Grant after the shocking casualty lists were published, replied with simple, prescient finality, "I can't spare this man. He fights." The peach orchard, where the beautiful blossoms had been shot to pieces and mingled with the fallen, and the sunken road, now a mass grave, stood as grim, silent testaments to a nation's violent, painful rebirth. The innocence of April 5th was gone forever, replaced by the hard, sober, and terrifying knowledge that the road to reunion and the preservation of the Union would be long, agonizing, and paved with the bodies of tens of thousands more. It began here, in this place of horrific industrial-scale slaughter, at a place called Shiloh, the Hebrew word for place of peace. The battle's enduring legacy was not merely one of tactical maneuvers, captured flags, and sterile casualty lists, but a profound psychological scar seared into the national consciousness of both North and South, a grim premonition of the industrialized slaughter that would define the coming years at places like Antietam, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, and Spotsylvania. It demonstrated with horrifying, undeniable clarity that the individual courage of the soldier, while magnificent and often breathtaking, was increasingly irrelevant when pitted against the impersonal, grinding machinery of modern warfare, where massed artillery and long-range rifle fire decided fates from a distance, turning battle into a deadly, statistical exercise. The commanders, too, were forever changed by the Shiloh experience. Sherman shed his pre-war insecurities and a brief reputation of instability to become the relentlessly logical, hard war warrior of the Atlanta campaign and the March to the Sea. His psyche permanently hardened, and his belief in total war solidified in the fire of Shiloh's surprise and shock. While Grant's simple, brutal arithmetic of attrition, the cold understanding that the Union could afford to lose men and material at a rate the Confederacy could never hope to match, found its first, terrible validation on these fields. For the common soldier, North and South, Shiloh was a loss of innocence more complete than any battlefield defeat or victory. It was the moment they understood, in their gut, that they were not knights in a romantic epic, but expendable components in a vast and terrible national conflict. A meat grinder whose end was nowhere in sight. A conflict that would demand everything they had to give: their health, their sanity, their lives, and more before its final bloody conclusion at Appomattox, Courthouse 3 long years later.